So we have begun. I'm going to finish up neurotransmitters. There's a little bit left to go over it and start the next chapter, which is, this is the one I'm going to try to compact a little bit. But what I put up there is my construct of kind of how things work for the brain, which I've only been doing that same construct for 27 years. Since I very first started to teach. But enough of that anyway. All right, we're here. We got to be here. Let's do it. Just a quick catch up. Acetylcholine, we don't have to catch up on. We caught up on that a lot. Again, you're going to see, if you look at that construct I put on the board for those who can see it, or if you want to take a picture of it, that's fine. For instance, these are typically where we see these produced. The catecholamines are in the midbrain. They're not exclusively so, but in the midbrain, you're going to see, when we take a look at the autonomic nervous system, that norepinephrine and epinephrine are also produced in the adrenal, what's called the adrenal medulla, in the adrenal gland, hence the derivation of the name adrenaline. Okay, and so that's noteworthy. And typically they are excitatory, depending on the receptor, but the vast majority are excitatory. Again, these play a role that's not necessarily clearly understood. They both are the characteristic of these indolamines because of the chemical structure is called an indole. And it's interesting, you're going to run into that a little bit in microlab if you're taking microlab. It's one of the tests that you do, looking to identify indoles in certain bacteria. Okay, serotonin comes from tryptophan. We talked about that. Typically, it depends on the location. It can be excitatory, it can be relaxing. It plays different roles in the bloodstream. You're going to see a lot of that in inflammation. So it's kind of widespread. It's not always a neurotransmitter. Might be the way to describe it. Sometimes in the bloodstream it acts a little bit differently. Histamine, same deal. It's a neurotransmitter. It's a neurotransmitter is the role in the brain, but as I said, it plays a pivotal role in understanding how allergies are mediated and nasty things like asthma and anaphylactic shock, hives, that kind of stuff. And so a variety of different things are there, and there's, you almost have to look at each individual system. The autonomic nervous system, norepinephrine is one of the, norepinephrine and acetylcholine are the only two agents, and as I said, that's our whole last week, pretty much is associated with that. And yeah, as far as we know, imbalances in all of these are related with not just, I hate to use the term mental illness, okay, because it's so vague. I don't know that mental illness is not, I don't know that it's clearly understood in a lot of these things. It's very hard to quantify. But I mean, but effectively, this is the way we treat them, through modifying, either making more there or, sort of combating those. So the amino acids, again, just plain amino acids. So this real name is amino acid, would be glutamic acid. I use the term glutamate, aspartate, glycine. Those are all of the 20 amino acids that, from the construction of all proteins. I don't know what this is necessarily derived as. We just say GABA. It's a lot easier than gamma aminobutyric acid. Consistently, glutamate and aspartate are typically excitatory. Glycine and GABA are typically inhibitory. Again, these are known for opening up those chloride-gated channels. And that's really those are the big players. These ones are important, but I mean, they were not as clearly understood. Okay, substance P. It derives the name P because it plays a role in pain management. You might remember when we talked about arthritis, we looked at capsaicin. Okay, capsaicin creams are extracts of red peppers, generally hot red peppers, because the family name of all of those fruits is capsicums. Food science, love that. Okay, and what they do is, you might recall me telling you, about a third of the patients are relieved of a lot of arthritic pain. About a third can't tolerate it because it just makes their skin on fire, and a third has no effect. What it does is it diminishes substance P. Okay, so it takes away the pain in that regard. That's the understanding of that mechanism. It's a little different than something called a TENS unit, which is almost like, jamming the signal, like jamming a radar signal back in the old days. As though you're stopping your internet from getting to your brain, so to speak. That's different. You don't see that measured here. That's a whole other mechanism, just for context. These are very interesting. Endorphin stands for endogenous morphine analogs. Morphine is the basis for understanding pain. When we talk about painkillers, they're all related to opium alkaloids. I used to take to a very elaborate course with regard to addiction and drugs in the human body for a number of years. Fascinating stuff. And we make these. If you didn't know, this is years ago when they talked with people when the running craze got started. They talked about the runner's high. When you reach, and many of you, particularly in athletics, well, it's this sense of well-being. It's almost like they say you're going through a wall, that type of stuff. You reach the point where you're starting to release these. And there's a lot of things that they do. For instance, gut-brain peptides regulate digestion, but all of these, it's like the pleasure that we derive. Okay, opiates in general are relaxing agents, but they trigger our pleasure centers. And so this is the nature of it. When we take more of them, okay, we've made pharmacologically. So it's very, very interesting. They all start from, and it's been the source of a lot of problems, continues to be. You just have to look at all of the problems today with drug manufacture. It's just awful. It's awful, awful, awful. But these are naturally occurring, and so you should at least be aware of them. They're relatively short chain polypeptides, as are these. And when you talk about digestion down the road in AP2, you'll probably re-examine those again. These are interesting, purines. So you may recall me telling you this again. ATP, effectively, why we call it a purine, remember adenine and guanine are considered purines. And the one that plays the most important role is adenine bonded to ribose. That's an ATP when you lop off the 3 Ps. So it doesn't have, that's called adenosine triphosphate. Lop them off, now you got adenosine. And it's a very much of an inhibitor. And effectively, this is what I do every morning. This is probably cup number 4 by this time, trying to get me going in the morning. I used to do it by having a Pepsi in the morning, but I could easily go back to that, might I? Okay. I like that stuff. And you can see it can induce calcium influx in astrocytes, however that's supposed to work. But the whole idea is it blocks those adenosine receptors. That's something to remember, right? These are also interesting. You're going to hear a lot down the road about how different gases. Now, some of the, believe it or not, things that are toxins in our environment, like carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide, which are, think of they're part of auto fume exhaust. Hydrogen sulfide is that terrible rotten egg smell you tend to get, okay? Believe it or not, we make those gases endogenously in very small amounts, and it's not exactly sure what they do. The one that's the most fascinating is called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide, as you can see, involves in learning and memory, brain damage and stroke, smooth muscle relaxation. Nitric oxide, when it's for instance, periodically, and particularly as people get older, their small blood vessels become a little too narrow. It's just like high blood pressure, a little too stiff. When blood pulses through them, typically those lining cells release a little bit of nitric oxide, and it helps to open up the blood vessels. And indeed, maybe the most successful launched medication of all time by Pfizer Labs called sildenafil. Does anybody know what sildenafil is? Oh, you're going to learn Viagra, magic blue pill. What it does is it basically blocks the breakdown of nitric oxide. And that was a landmark kind of discovery. I mean, they had people were looking at this stuff for years, and now they're made in a variety of things. When it first came out, maybe 30 years ago or so, I mean, it made Pfizer an immense amount of money, as you might suspect. Those types of things that are there. And it has a lot of applications as well. But nitric oxide is what dilates your blood vessels for a variety of reasons. And you can see it's a very valuable. It plays a role in the heart as well. It plays particularly a role in circulation. So down the way you're going to see it, as you can see, its role in the brain is somewhat understood. But we know when they say involved, it's very non-specific. This is very interesting vis-a-vis stroke patients and things like that. Again, as I remind you, my granddaughter, who's now 8+, 8.5, had a stroke when she was born. And I mean, it's remarkable considering the significant amount of structural damage. How well, I mean, she's doing really well in school. They didn't think she would walk or talk. And oh boy. I mean, you can see the motor damage, but the thing damage. And one day, if I'm really on my game, maybe I can show you a nice picture, or maybe I'll have a video with her when she's running and racing and stuff like that. I mean, it's every time I look at that, it's like, oh, we're so happy because those were very difficult days for my son and daughter. Here's a little bit of interesting thing about, if you did not know it, we have endogenous, that's what it is, cannabinoids. And what a cannabinoid is basically a similar compound to the active ingredient in marijuana, which is tetrahydrocannabinol. It's a lot more, now we talk about it easily today in this age of medical marijuana, and many states legalize marijuana and variety of, and I'm fine. As long as you're not doing it and driving a car, same thing as drinking, that's fine. I mean, I have a certain degree of personal experience with it over 7 years. The statute of limitations is expired. Don't think about calling anybody. I gave all of that up when I became a doctor. When I started treating patients, I basically said, no more. I can accept the fact that I make a mistake with a diagnosis or a treatment on my own. I wouldn't like it, but I could accept the fact. But if I did it because I was impaired, that's not good. That's weakness. That's unacceptable. So moving on from that, we make this stuff, and this is why it's so complex. This chemical, tetrahydrocannabinol, it breaks down into a myriad of products. This CBD and THC are just examples of it, if you're familiar at all with that kind of stuff. I am not. My wife has a condition where they thought it would be helpful to have no impact whatsoever. So she had one of those medical marijuana things, but basically totally useless. Okay, most commonly, as you see, and these are, you might recall, G protein receptors. I'll show it to you again ever so briefly. I don't want to get into it. The whole idea is they're lipid soluble. Okay, and lipid soluble things stay with you for a long time. A word to the wise. Okay, all of you. I don't know what fields you're going into. Drug testing is fairly commonplace. They want a drug-free world. I'm not even talking about people in athletics or things like that. My son's carries a license from TSA to haul hazardous materials. I mean, whenever he goes on board to a new job or a new position, even if he has an accident, somebody plowed into him one time in a truck carrying propane or explosives. Well, first thing you got to do is get drug tested and things like that. First thing, before they literally drive him to the hospital or to one of those places to get that, to understand the significance of this. If you're in that game, things like marijuana stay in your system for about 30 days, and your hair longer. That's why they test people who are cocaine addicts, and they have to do random testing. They do random testing about twice a week. It has a relatively short half-life. So do amphetamines, relatively short half-life. So after about 2 to 3 days, you're not in your system, so they randomly test them 2 to 3 times a week. Marijuana and cannabinol stay in your system a whole lot longer. It's your life. Do what you want to do. Okay, but be aware of certain things. That's how it comes back to bite. And hair samples even longer. It's all good. So you have to understand. I matriculated. We had one of the students. I hope she's looked at the videos. I think I told you. I said I matriculated in the school the September immediately after this event called Woodstock. I was at that generation, hippies and stuff like that. My best friend had hair longer than any of yours. E. Mine was shorter than this. I was odd. And so all of these types of things, and this is what we know about them, why they are medically relevant. We've known this for years. If you did not know, marijuana at one point was a class 1 narcotic. It's not even a narcotic, okay? But it was a class 1 controlled substance, have no medical benefit. Everybody knew that for people on cancer who lose their appetite, because everybody it totally encouraged appetite. It made people who weren't hungry. People from cancer were getting chemotherapy, were getting nauseous. It helped with pain. It was augmented when they had to take really bad, significant pain medicines for cancer. It did all three of those things. That really had a lot. And then before we had the age of medical marijuana, people had to get special. And a lot of the states were reluctant. All sorts of those kinds of things until finally they were able to get this stuff in vogue. So it's very interesting. It certainly has a lot. And like I said, there's about several hundred different kinds of breakdown products that have been identified from this. And that industry will get more involved and more sophisticated, I suspect, as time persists. Almost done with this chapter. I don't do a lot of the last of it. So effects and actions. So the whole idea is excitatory or inhibitory. This is important for you to know. So it's either depolarizing, more likely to fire, inhibitory, less likely. It's all about the receptor. Typically, GABA and glycine contact those chloride-gated channels. Again, that's how sleeping pills work. That's how alcohol works. And basically, it makes certain nerves less likely to fire. Sometimes we used to talk about things called paradoxical effects. So why do people, why does somebody all of a sudden become the life of the party who's very quiet and sedate? We call it a disinhibiting agent. So if normally your circuits are saying, don't do these wild and crazy things, and all of a sudden a couple of drinks, and some people with there's a total change in person. It's really not. It's a little more scientific than that. And the biggest problem when we see problems vis-a-vis fights and things like that, alcohol probably number one on the hit parade. Amphetamines number two. People who do amphetamines become very, very agitated over long term. So we see that with regard to fights. And a lot of times they don't really hold their liquor very well. I mean, usually there's a scientific reason. I mean, I don't because of unfamiliarity. I have a drink up falling asleep. Definitely not the life of the party. However, I think a wonderful pan sauces with a very famous pan sauce steak Diane involves, and it's really one of cognac and cream, and green peppercorn, a little shallot, a little garlic. Everything's. That was actually developed in a restaurant or made famous in Baltimore down on the Inner Harbor area years ago. We ate there. Oh, that was good. A long time ago. So GABA, glutamate, and aspartate, usually excitatory. Acetylcholine and norepinephrine, mostly excitatory. We'll go over the exceptions when we get to autonomic nervous system. Acetylcholine is excitatory at the neuromuscular junction. And the one that's the most important to know as an exception, and it's going to be on this final exam, I guarantee it, is acetylcholine is what slows down your heart. Your heart would normally, this is part of cell cycle. Remember I told you biological things are governed. We hold them in check. Okay? What holds our heart would normally be over 100 beats per minute. That's not good. Somebody with a resting heart rate of 100 beats per minute is in big trouble. We're looking at somebody who had one at one point. All that smoking and stress and all that weight and stuff like that. Long story short, what your vagus nerve does is it governs your heart rate. It slows it down. That's the major paradoxical effect, or unusual, or doing the opposite thing. That's what paradoxical is for cardiac muscle. Direct action. When it opens those ion channels, sodium rushing in, potassium rushing out, chloride rushing in, all that kind of stuff, that's fast. Okay, rapid responses, acetylcholine amino acids. These are what we call indirect. They act through second messengers. You're going to see again what one of these G protein pathways. All it means is that it takes a while to trigger a mechanism. They contact outside the cell, they can't get inside the cell, and effectively, eventually, they trigger what's called a second messenger inside the cell that sets up a series of reactions, like insulin. It does a lot of things, stimulates growth and mitosis, stimulates, it's somewhat pro-inflammatory, unfortunately, but effectively, its major effect is to bring sugar into the cell. We did not know it. Carbohydrate metabolism has a somewhat of a pro-inflammatory effect, but it takes a while to get there. It's very, very fast, but it's hardly instantaneous, and they last longer, similar to hormones. Biogenic amines, those neuropeptides that I was talking about, the dissolved gases, they're not instantaneous effects. The endorphins, even though we chemically have in the laboratory, we've done some nasty things with morphine. Basically, you made it more lipid soluble. The faster it gets into your cell, the more addictive it is. That's the difference between morphine and heroin. Heroin, they just made it more fat soluble so it gets into your system fast. And they just continue to do that. Fentanyl even more rapidly. You get the idea. That's not better living through chemistry. That's worse living through chemistry. So I don't know whether you'll get a lot of that stuff. Like I said, it's a course we wanted to develop here, but we had too much similar stuff here that I was trying to get developed here for non-majors, non-science majors. So a lot of these are neuromodulators. That's what I was talking about before. Okay, it's not a clear role. That's like neuromodulating is imagine over time with those like the Paxil and Prozac and Zoloft stuff. Why does it take so long? Eventually, it alters things. Instead, it affects the strength of the synaptic transmission. It does not do it necessarily directly. It alters the sensitivity. We hope that with like those, that they actually are more likely to trigger certain receptors. And sometimes they're just on a local event. So neuromodulator, I think the best way to summarize it is it's not clear exactly what it does. It doesn't work in that predictable way. Okay. So when you have those ion channels very, very quickly, again, sodium in, chloride out. So when they open, big changes that are there. The G protein thing, without going into all these different things that are there, whether it's, and we'll talk about what muscarinic means down the road. Okay. That's autonomic nervous system. But again, dopamine and norepinephrine, those neuropeptides, this whole idea, the first messenger is the dopamine. It goes through a series of effects that you don't have to know, but eventually inside the cell, something like calcium basically triggers almost like a cascade of events, opening and closing, then the ion channels, activating enzymes, adding phosphates, doing genetic things, maybe making more proteins. Okay, it's very elaborate. And I'm giving it to you for context. I promise you, I'm not going to ask about it. Because it's really, this textbook, it's not a bad example, but it basically showing here's dopamine, and it sets off a chain reaction along the membrane, and eventually it releases these second messengers, calcium, cyclic AMP, and then boom, all of a sudden it triggers a reaction. When you get to diabetes, you might talk about it more in endocrine because it's understood a little bit better. It's an enzyme called tyrosine, that name again, kinase. And that's it. I'm not doing the neural integration. I'm not doing neuronal pools, discharge and facilitated zones, and serial processing. I'm not going crazy about reflexes. Okay. Parallel processing, diverging, converting, reverberating, parallel after discharge. You could go nuts. This is more stuff for a neurology course. And that really concludes that chapter 11 material. Which brings us to this bad boy over here. So I'd rather explain it and get started. This is the major brain regions. It's like, if you want to think of it this way, it goes from higher order functioning to lower order. So if you can't see it over here, you have a picture later. The whole idea is the part that does the most, that we have conscious control over, at the cerebral level, the cerebral lobe. Effectively, it's the gray matter that's doing it. So we tend to call that the cerebral cortex. Remember, the cortex is on the outside. There's only two parts of the brain that have cortex that are high order processing. One is the cerebrum, so we'll have cerebral, and underneath it, really, are the cortices, cortex is similar, and the same thing with the cerebellum. So principally it's divided into 4 lobes. There's one more primitive lobe on the inside called the insula. That's the one that's pretty much associated with smell, maybe some taste. Those are pretty primitive sensations. You got to kind of think of it from lower order animals higher. Okay? That type of stuff. It's like, I'm in the kitchen opening up something. I have a partner who all of a sudden is at my plate. He's like, here, my door. Oh, what are we having yet? Is it snack time? Oh, I love chicken. It's food. He loves it. So the cerebral cortexes or cortices, 4 main ones to know: frontal, motor, reason, advanced functions, logic, test taking, all of that type of stuff. Understanding gets filtered with the emotions. It's not that simple, because anything we make a decision, how many of you have told me that you have test taking anxiety? That's an emotional thing that you have to learn to overcome when you're testing. So there's a lot that goes on with regards to communication, being able to respond to questions or answer questions on a test. All of those logic, reasoning, math, blah, 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 frontal. That's the big one. It's the largest of the lobes. I mean, that's, and with every motor command that you have comes from there. Parietal, sensory. Not only sensory, but sensory processing. That's there. General sensory. We're not talking about special sense like hearing or eyesight. So, I mean, if you're sitting on that chair and all of a sudden, well, that's uncomfortable here, I'm in one place, I'm going to shift, sensory. The tip of whatever the temperature is going to be today in this room. Sensory. That's, you feel that through the parietal lobe. They kind of all work together. So it might tell you a particular sense, and then basically process it a little bit, try to identify what it is, and then shift it on how am I going to respond, then it goes to the front. There. Temporal is mostly auditory and balance. That 8th cranial nerve, the stibulocochlear, in the bell. Internal acoustic vagus, where it terminates. That's what that means. Quarter of a century. I'm supposed to know this stuff. Nevertheless, that is where you find that. And there's a whole lot more. Temporal lobe is pretty interesting. Occipital, vision. Nearly half of your circuitry is all about vision. So visual. So we respond to the way we interact with it. We see something, we respond to it. So vision is very, very complex. So we'll see something, we'll process it, and we'll send it forward. We hear something, we process it, then we'll send it. Some things that are really important, like all of a sudden that siren behind you, you have more immediate response. And you can get into a lot of this. So, and basically your orders to do stuff, grab that, come from the cerebral lobe, particularly from the frontal lobe. How I do that, whether I have a tough time initiating it, whether I can't quite get there, or I do it overly fast like that, that's all of those basal nuclei. they mediate or alter, and they give you what we call fine motor control. That's why they're implicated. Isn't it sort of a non-specific term we use today? Parkinson's disease is a disorder in fine movement. Some people have excessive, some people have insufficient, they have different starting and stopping the thing. It's a side effect of a lot of medications, Parkinson's-like problems, and sometimes it's fearful, post-traumatic. In the old days, we used to call boxers punch drunk, but in reality, they would present with this. We see football players, people worse with the CTE, all those types of suicidal things. We just saw him with a 24-year-old in Dallas. I'm sure that had something to do with it. Terrible, tragic. But that's really what it is. And indeed, importantly, we think it has to do with a limitation of dopamine. That neurotransmitter, so much so there's a really important pathway that comes from the midbrain where it makes those catecholamines, goes all the way up to the basal loop. Interesting. So as we go down, this we're under conscious control. This not so much. We're there overrides. But this is conscious. As we get down here, now we're into the subconscious area. This is a sophisticated system, the diencephalon. You'll see this. Let's skip through the PowerPoint. You can see the name slide up there. Diencephalon is surrounded by something called the limbic system. That's your emotional control. To find balance between emotional control and cognitive control. Some people can't keep their emotions in check for the rage. Some people appear very unemotional by design. It's almost like it's almost underserved. Plays a pivotal role in addictive disease, and as you might have guessed, one of the things that happens with that, with addictive disease, is your pleasure center is there. What makes people addictive is it provides them some type of pleasure. I have an addictive personality. I'm an expert. I'm addicted to food. I was addicted to pain pills. I was addicted to cigarettes forever. I got to stay in those green tables over down there next to the stadium. Didn't see you here. Good thing. Behave. I'm looking for you guys next time in the casino. Don't start. It should be you. They work next time. I do now a little. That plays a role, and there's also a pathway from the midbrain because of the catecholamines and dopamine up there. So it's a very internetwork system. It really consists of three areas. The thalamus. Thalamus is a processing center and a relay center. All of your, it does more than that. All of your sensation comes in there. Smelled that. What does that mean? It shuttles it to the right part of the brain. Okay, I heard that. What should I do about that? I saw that. And so all of those centers go to the thalamus. All your visual circuitry goes to the thalamus before it goes to this part of your brain for processing. Oh, send it over there. This seems important. It sorts, edits, relays is the way it's described. Part of it's huge. It's the biggest part of this. Epithalamus is tiny. You may or may not have seen something called pineal. But really, in short, I put question marks. We don't know what it is, but we do know that it generates melatonin, so it probably plays a role in sleep. Careful if you're one of those folks who wants to take some melatonin. Somebody said, "Oh, if you're having trouble sleeping, take one of those." It doesn't make everybody sick. Some people are really knocked out. You get up and it's like, you want to, if it's the first time you take it until you know, don't be getting up and getting in the car or something like that because you can. So this is, it overwhelms some people. It's dose specific. I've never tried it. And the hypothalamus, that's the area where the blood-brain barrier is weakest. That's the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. It's that same thing. All of a sudden, that guy cut you off on the road this morning, and your nervous system did this, but the endocrine system is prolonging that effect. Your heart's racing, you're breathing fast, you're agitated. Oh, you're doing that. Boy, that could have been a bad accident. Whatever. You get the idea. That's the linkage is there. And now after that, now we get into what's called the brain stem. And by definition, three parts, midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. We don't have it. That's why it's the brain stem. It's good news and bad news. The good news is, as long as it's functioning, everything is fine. The bad news is there's damage there. There's discontrol. When we get particularly to the pons and medulla, heart, respiration, basic bodily function. If those are messed up, you're someone gets a cancer there or damage there from trauma. Really never a good prognosis for that. The midbrain makes the catecholamines. The midbrain has some interesting structures associated with it. And then finally, what effectively is a relay center, sending signals out and bringing signals in. There's really no processing that goes on. Spinal cord. Going down, up and going down, that's all. There's really no processing that goes on in the spinal cord. That's the construct. But there's one other neat area. It sits behind. Did you talk about the cerebellum? Because you dissected a sheep brain, the sheep's got cerebellum. See, if the sheep's cerebellum wasn't working, he would probably lose his balance. So you ever see those, like, the goats falling over one of those videos? It must be your cerebellum. So cerebellum is the other high functioning area. It's the second largest area in your brain. So you have a cerebellar cortices as well. It's involved in motor control, motor coordination, and it's ipsilateral. What does he mean by this? Most of the signals your body produces are contralateral. Contra is opposite. The left side of the brain, I do right hand. Side of the brain, I do my left. Ipsilateral, the same size. So what it does is it puts together all of that really remarkable stuff we hardly give second thought to. Like when I tell you, oh, we're done for today, you all do this. Do you ever think about what's going on? No. I'm going to my next class. You're on autopilot. Close my computer. I'm going to unplug. If I'm unplug, I put my stuff away, get my coat on. You think I've got to remember with my left foot, my right foot, with my left foot, swivel my. No, you don't think they just start walking. Right? From this class, you want to get out of here fast. Good. I got a smile out of this. You're supposed to be smiling because you got to compensate for messing Monday. I know you got your 6 hours of sort of. It's because you're told. Okay, that's what your cerebellum does. Why I said that about it, your cerebellum has a lot to do with all that. It's almost like muscle memory. It files, it does, the most connections are in the cerebellum. But you and I don't give a second thought about these things, right? We know we're walking. We just kind of go, I mean, I can close my eyes and turn around, right? It's because your cerebellum, you know what's doing that? You need 3 things. You need your cerebellum. You only need 2 of the 3. Cerebellum, what we call proprioceptors. Did you mention the term proprioceptors? And what? No, I wouldn't expect that you would have necessarily. Did you mention them? Look, if I say, everybody, close your eyes and tell me where your arm is. How many of you would know where your arm is? You know your hands were like that. You know your hands are like this. You know you're grabbing your shoulder. She's writing over there. Okay, right? You're doing something you're writing on your iPad. You're writing on, on your iPad. You all know that. Proprioceptors. You know if your head was going tilted this way. You know if your tongue was out. You know if you did the old roll your tongue thing. You all know that. That's your proprioceptors, little sensors all over the body. So you need 1, your cerebellum, 2, your proprioceptors, 3, your eyes. So as long as I can see, even if my cerebellum didn't work, and you'll see people, if they have damage to their cerebellum from an injury or a tumor or medication, it's not making it work, they watch where they put their teeth. And a lot of times, unfortunately, diabetics do that. The problem with diabetics A lot of them lose sensation in their feet. It's called chronic peripheral neuropathy. They can't feel their feet, so they actually have to watch where they put them. So as long as you have two of those three, you can get around. So for instance, if you had somebody who would close their eyes and your cerebellum wasn't working, you just have your proprioceptors. What happens if when they do this, if they tell somebody then, put your finger on your nose. And obviously I can do it, walk a straight line. Backwards, turn around, wherever you are. Put your hands on your hips. When does that happen? Who would ask you to do something? Close your eyes and do that. And none of you should have had this experience personally. No. Thank goodness I'm surrounded by people of good character. That's the field sobriety test. Thank goodness you didn't know. And all of a sudden somebody's in the car and they get them to come out. Okay, right, walk this line, close your eyes and walk this straight line. So put your finger on your nose, touch your hair, and they just break down laughing because they're so blitzed. Famous name for that is called Romberg's sign. That means that only one of the three of those is working. So when you close your eyes, the alcohol goes to the cerebellum, just left with proprioceptors, and you can't do much about it. That's all just a little intro to what's going on in that upstairs part of your brain. So this is why it's helpful to understand all those things. And many of you who are going into like clinical fields, you got to get a feel for these types. I watch somebody when they walk in. So many clues. Or we call it, when they're unbalanced, we call it ataxia, A-T-A-X-I-A. Not that you have to know that, but you're already beginning to. It tells you different things. If somebody's down there looking on the floor, is it diabetic neuropathy? Like that, or are they unstable for another reason? Does mean there's some damage in that area. We don't have to think that they're a chronic alcoholic or things like that. In the old days, it was common in syphilis, particularly either what's called tertiary. We talk about that in micro tertiary syphilis, or congenital, meaning you were born with it because one of your parents had it and passed it on to you at birth. All that stuff. There's a lot that goes on in the human brain. But I've been doing that construct for a long time, and this is a good day to do it because we didn't have a whole lot left to do on neurotransmitters. The whole idea, remember, the central nervous system, brain, spinal cord. That's it. Cephalization means the higher order functionings, the development of the cerebral cortex is something we have developed over time. Okay, it's why the sheep's not dissecting us, we're dissecting the sheep. That's okay. I usually get a thanks. I guess you have to have me do that in the lab. I guess when you did the brain, Dr. Robbins didn't play Judy Garland and the Scarecrow singing "I Only Had a Brain." Many of you have heard that song. Lord love a duck. I don't worry so much about it. The only one of these that sticks around, this is the original terminology, mesencephalon. Because the only part that hasn't really changed a lot in development is the midbrain. And basically what this is, without going through all the terminology and stuff like that, all these different areas, this is probably the telling thing. It's a tube filled with fluid. It starts as something called a neural tube. And I'll just do this slide and we'll be done. The neural tube we are born with. And what makes us? We have certain things, three things that make us vertebrates. Pharyngeal pouches, which become our auditory canal, or acoustic canal, or eustachian tube, middle ear. We have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. This is that, okay, and it's filled with fluid. That's what the blue is. And something called a notochord. The remnants of that is the nucleus pulposus, you might remember, in the middle of the intervertebral disc. You got an annulus fibrosus and a nucleus pulposus. Ringing a bell? So if you had that, you should. So what happens is all this is done is expanded higher. And the yellowish area there, those are the cortices forming here and in the cerebellum. And this is the fluid. And effectively, it's just a series of expansions and changes in shape of basically this hollow tube. Larger here, narrows in certain areas, and it begins to develop these areas of the brain that you can see that I wrote up there. The telencephalon, the brain, the basal nuclei, the diencephalon. Actually, your eyes become part of that. Your retina really is an outpouch of that. The midbrain is the midbrain. And then finally, we get to the brain stem and the cerebellum itself, and finally, the spinal cord. And so, because it grows so fast, it has to kind of curve around. I'll stop it there, and we'll look a little bit at the brain development when we get back. We won't look until Wednesday, obviously, because Monday's the exam. All right. See you then. As usual, I'll be here, relatively early on the exam day. Thank you. Have a good weekend.